This fifth video is the first of two videos on what history is as a discipline and how that discipline developed over time, as it's commonly referred to historiography. History is the recorded past, usually in some form of writing. History, then, is just a small part of the past, most of which is not recorded. The large majority of the past is known as prehistory. While historians deal with history, prehistory is the domain of anthropology. Anthro, by the way, implies man, and ology implies the study of. There are a number of ways anthropologists study prehistory. Physical anthropologists study bones and evidence of physical evolution. Cultural anthropologists study oral traditions and other aspects of cultural development. Archaeologists study evidence and artifacts left behind and often dig from the earth. We study history for a number of reasons. Obviously, one is to learn from the past. Students are probably familiar with the old adage, those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. We also study history to learn about ourselves and our society, how we became what we are. And historical knowledge is vital for proper perspective and understanding of current events. As a study of real people with all their faults and strengths, history can also be entertaining. The recorded past is full of interesting characters and exciting developments. Another old adage applies here. The only thing new is the history you don't know. An historian's job is to record what happened in the past as accurately as possible. This means that an historian tries to eliminate all of his or her own bias and relies solely on the relevant evidence. An historian will draw conclusions about the past because history is a tale of cause and effect. Put another way, historians deal with why things happened and their ramifications, and thus conclusions are not only unavoidable but vital for the discipline. History is not simply reciting unconnected facts, but rather analyzing them and drawing conclusions. These conclusions must be as free from the historian's personal bias as possible. The historian doesn't go into research with preconceived notions that guide his or her study. The evidence itself, the written record uncovered itself, forms the basis of the historian's conclusions. It should be noted that history is not historical fiction. Written for entertainment only, historical fiction takes real characters from the past and contrives a story about them. There is little or no effort to document the past accurately. Historical fiction is often enjoyable, especially when seen on television, but its danger lies when people begin to perceive it as documented truth. It goes without saying that historians draw different conclusions about the same past event. They may uncover new evidence or combine old evidence in a different way. They may stress different events from different perspectives. History is, in the end, therefore, a debate. People debate about current events, and it follows they debate about the past as well. In writing good history, historians naturally rely on the work of previous historians. They may agree or disagree, but they build upon previous works. History is always being rewritten from the perspective of the present day, which suggests new angles for study or new conclusions to build upon. The study of history as a discipline is known as historiography. In its broadest sense, historiography includes not only the methodology of studying past records, but also the different conclusions. It looks at the evolving interpretation of events, the central arguments and debates. The remaining portion of this video will look at how history developed as a discipline, and then it will look at some of the schools of thought that have developed in historiography. First, however, it should be noted that the discipline of history is sometimes referred to as Clio, the ancient Greek muse for history. The first to attempt to record the past accurately without a predetermined objective were the ancient Greeks. One can, of course, look at earlier writings such as the various scriptures of the Bible, or alternatively cuneiform or hieroglyphics, all of which gave people insight. These writings, however, were intended to make a case, to prove a point, to evangelize. In short, not simply to record accurately what happened. They're not history. When historians read these earlier writings, they must try to understand and consider the author's individual objectives, their biases in utilizing them. Writing in the 5th century before Christ, the Greek historian Herodotus is often called the father of history. He traveled a lot and recorded what he saw and heard. He's especially known for his account of the Persian Wars. Another famous Greek historian was Thucydides, who wrote a famous account of the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta. Writing in the 4th century before Christ, Plutarch, a priest at the temple of Apollo in Delphi, wrote on the lives of several great Greeks and Romans, most famously the rogue Roman general Mark Antony in Egypt. In many respects, by recounting individual lives, Plutarch appears the first real biographer in history. In any event, the early Greek historians tended to focus on recent events of their day and on battles. They loved great heroes. They, however, in no way conducted research in the modern sense of the word. The Roman era is known for two great historians. Cato the Elder was the first to write history in Latin and not Greek. With Latin used throughout the empire, Cato's writings had a much broader impact. Another famous Roman historian was Tacitus. Ancient Rome saw a proliferation of historians, and collectively they stressed style and elegance in their writing. Their history resembled literature, with more emphasis on the beauty and enjoyment of reading than on precise research. After Rome fell, there wasn't much history in the Middle Ages. People, of course, wrote, but the only people doing so, indeed often the only people literate, were the man or priest. They were, of course, writing to win converts and not to record accurately the past, and thus their writing cannot be considered history. Once again, their writings are quite useful for later historians, but these later historians must always consider the context of what they are. The Renaissance and later the Enlightenment produced what one might consider the first modern history. Historians were better at removing their own biases, building on the works of others, and conducting research in an organized and sustained way. They were also the first to begin to cite their research as documentation to back up their conclusions. Perhaps the most famous historian of the Enlightenment was Edward Gibbon, who spent years researching ancient documents and writing his 1776 seminal book, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It should be noted that the Renaissance and Enlightenment produced a great number of writers about the past, but they were largely approaching the past from a theoretical perspective. Many tended to be selective in their analysis of past events to argue far against broader theories about mankind or politics. Yet again, they are useful for later historians, but these historians must consider the context. One of the most famous of these theoreticians was Niccolo Machiavelli, famous for his book The Prince, which argued in a nutshell that in politics the end justified the means. Famous Enlightenment writers using past events to advocate theories were Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, all famous for writings that inspired the American Revolution. Many date the beginning of history as a defined and separate academic discipline, requiring specific training and employing an established methodology of research and writing, to the late 19th century. Here the most important influence is the German historian Leopold von Ranke. Von Ranke stressed to students the absolute critical importance of removing one's prejudices and relying on wherever the research led them. He stressed the importance of his students placing their own research and conclusions in the context of other conclusions. He began to identify specific ways to deal with documents, organizing and saving them, and he sought uniformity in the way historians cited their evidence. By von Ranke's time, universities in Europe began to offer specific degrees in history, the most important being the doctorate. The American universities soon followed. By the 20th century, the discipline of history began to develop broad schools of thought. Historians, of course, still attempted to remove their own biases and still relied on the evidence, but the conclusions of many were similar and in time grouped together in people's minds. Within American history, for example, there were consensus or traditional historians on one side and the progressive historians on the other. There were no formal organization or unity, but the writings of individual historians reflected from time to time broader conclusions and characteristics that certain of their colleagues, shared. These two schools of history have ebbed and flowed as long as historians have been writing about America's past. Consensus historians tended to stress that the ideas and culture Americans shared were more important than their differences. Accordingly, these historians did not stress conflict in American history. They did not deny that conflict existed, but they saw a much narrower range of divisive issues compared to other nations of the world. America's divisions never approached the nastiness of European revolutions and uprising. Consensus historians tended to celebrate America's accomplishments and achievements, often praising democracy and capitalism. They de-emphasized American history as a series of different and distinct eras, rather stressing continuity in American institutions and culture. The writings of some consensus historians emphasized America's uniqueness and even implied a bit of American superiority. Consensus history was popular early in the nation's history, soon after the American independence, and during the period of manifest destiny. The most obvious or famous of the consensus historians of this age, at least, was George Bancroft, who served as an American diplomat and completed a massive 3-volume history of the United States in the 1830s. Progressive historians, by contrast, tended to stress more conflict and change in American history, not continuity. They tended to write of cycles of reform. They wrote of rich versus poor, section versus section, ethnicity versus ethnicity, religion versus religion, and liberalism versus conservatism. One of the greatest early progressive historians was Charles Beard, who wrote a famous book on the Founding Fathers. He depicted the Constitution as a reaction of wealthy landowners consolidating and protecting their wealth. Progressive history, not surprisingly, was popular after the Civil War and during the late Industrial Revolution, with its extremes in wealth. During the middle of the 20th century, as America fought Nazism and communism, consensus historians began to make a comeback, sort of becoming popular. A famous consensus historian of this post-World War II age was Richard Hofstadter. During the upheavals of the 1960s, including the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, progressive history then made its own comeback. Some referred to the 1960s progressive historians as the New Left historians, corresponding to the broader term often used for politics during that period. Undoubtedly, consensus and progressive historians will continue to ebb and flow as events unfold in the future. Other schools of thought include great man history and new social history. Great man historians tended to stress that powerful elites were the engine of history, the primary determinant of what happens. While these elites may be social, cultural, or economic elites, great man history tended to stress political elites. Political history, the venue of the powerful who made and enforced laws, was what historians should analyze. The poor masses were simply swept about by these great men, powerless and less worthy of historical study. Not surprisingly, great man history researched more in laws and government records, and they did biographies and memoirs, all reflective of what the mighty few had done. Great man history was dominant throughout the first 2 centuries in America, but this began to change with the 1960s and the social revolutions of that age. New social history emerged collectively, suggesting that it was not the powerful elites that drove historical events, but broad, sweeping economic or social movements. If one wanted to analyze the engine of history, they should study the masses, the common folk collectively, because the movements they formed led to their leaders. It was a bottom-up history, not top-down. A case in point may help explain. A great man historian may argue that Adolf Hitler caused World War II. Without Hitler, things might have turned out differently. A new social historian, by contrast, would say that Hitler was merely a product of rampant anti-Semitism in the German Weimar Republic, and that the Germans' desire to seek revenge for the defeat in World War I. Had there not been Hitler, there would have been somebody else. New social historians tended to research in areas no previous historian explored. They looked at aggregate numbers and statistics, and when computers emerged, it helped them considerably. They worked with newer fields in social sciences, such as psychology and sociology. New areas of potential analysis and new sources meant that suddenly the discipline of history grew and diversified. People began to study not just politics or economics, but environmental history, religious history, African American history, gay and lesbian history, and most notably women's history, to name just a few. These areas of historical exploration remain popular in the discipline today. The discipline of history remains, as it always has been, a vibrant and dynamic academic subject. This concludes the first of 2 videos on history and historiography. The next video will pick up where this one left off.